I don't have any doubt, zero doubt, that if American aid, the amount of American aid continues, but it's continued with far more advanced American weapons, including those Tomahawks, which actually are not advanced. It's 1980s technology like the ATACMS, but they fly farther and have a bigger payload. And we begin to send F-16s in quantity. We train the Ukrainian pilots promptly. Ukraine will begin to push the Russians back on the battlefield. I don't have any doubt about that. The problem is the timidity of the policy to date and the prospect of a far more disastrous American policy if the naive folks around Trump have their way. But assuming, again, if we get a Trump who understands the stakes the way I've laid them out and is not intimidated by the Russians the way Biden has been, things will turn up very nicely.
Well, one thing that may determine where things go in the future is how the conflict in Ukraine is actually going on the ground. And I thought we could speak briefly about that now, because we understand Ukrainian troops are already in direct conflict with North Korean troops who have moved to support the Russian invasion. What's your assessment of the current state of play in regard to the conflict on the front line?
I think that the situation is more difficult now than it was a few weeks ago. And I think that Ukraine had a hard time starting late last year up through this spring, principally, but not only, because of the withholding of American aid. And that meant they had to be very careful with the ammunition and some of the weapon systems that they had. But then starting late spring, early summer, things began to improve along Ukraine's defensive lines in Donbass. And then they launched what has proved to be a quite successful incursion into the Kursk Oblast of Russia. And so I would say from the beginning of that until maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, things were moving back somewhat in Ukraine's direction. Not just because of what they were doing in Kursk, but because of the impact of that on the front lines. But Russia seems to have now parried, at least partly, the offensive into Kursk and have resumed momentum in Ukraine's east. But they've done that with exceptional casualties, which may or may not be sustainable. I say may or may not because the North Korean factor is a new one. And if this is just the beginning of a pipeline of troops, then even those massive casualties are sustainable for another year or so. So it's a more perilous moment right now. The Ukrainians, though, I believe, are well established in Kursk, despite the current Russian counteroffensive, which is creating some problems on Ukraine's flanks. They're well dug in south of the River Seine. And of course, Putin gave a deadline of October 1st for quote-unquote liberating Kursk. It didn't happen. It's not going to happen this calendar year. I'm safe in projecting. And I believe the Ukrainian line will hold as long as Western assistance is not weakened. And again, we know that there's increasing pressure on Biden to let Ukraine use American ATACMS, the longer range American ATACMS, deeper into Russia. By the way, it's ridiculous that people describe those as deep strike weapons because they go all of 180 miles and Russia's 9,000 miles from east to west. Even if we gave Ukraine Tomahawks, which I believe we should give, with a range of 1,000 plus, that's not quite deep into Russia either, given how large Russia is. But that's somewhat deep into Russia. But the discussion of deep strike ATACMS is simply a sign of how ignorant our discourse is, driven in large part by the timidity of the Biden administration. They've made that connection because they're afraid of giving Ukraine those weapons because they've been intimidated by Russia's nuclear threats.
And the presence of North Korean troops in this conflict has led some to suggest, well, there is no argument rationally, I know sort of dangerous to use the word rational when you're talking about Vladimir Putin, but there's no rational argument as to why NATO troops shouldn't be fighting on behalf of Ukraine in this conflict. What possibility do you think that might be?
I hesitate to raise that subject, NATO troops getting involved. Although the logic you've just laid out is impeccable, because politics ain't logic, and politically that's just an extraordinarily controversial step, and not a necessary step. I don't have any doubt, zero doubt, that if American aid, the amount of American aid continues, but it's continued with far more advanced American weapons, including those Tomahawks, which actually are not advanced. It's 1980s technology like the ATACMS, but they fly farther and have a bigger payload. And we begin to send F-16s in quantity. We train the Ukrainian pilots promptly. Ukraine will begin to push the Russians back on the battlefield. I don't have any doubt about that. The problem is the timidity of the policy to date and the prospect of a far more disastrous American policy if the naive folks around Trump have their way. But assuming, again, if we get a Trump who understands the stakes the way I've laid them out and is not intimidated by the Russians the way Biden has been, things will turn up very nicely.
Zelensky, in the comments I referred to earlier, did present a victory plan to Western leaders, including to Donald Trump and to Joe Biden, a little while ago, which the Times' World Affairs editor Catherine Philp described as receiving a lukewarm response. Why do you think it did receive such a lukewarm response? And if that was the best Ukraine could come up with, why wasn't it backed more fully, do you think?
It received a lukewarm response because of the ultimate timidity of the West in this crisis. And that timidity comes principally from Washington, but enabled by Berlin, because Biden and Schultz have both been intimidated by Putin. His plan is sound because it requires Ukraine to regain a certain amount of initiative on the battlefield, which requires the United States and Germany and others to allow the ATACMS to strike into Russia, to send Tauruses and allow them to be used on Russian territory, and to consider even better weapon systems, even more able weapon systems. And we know that the White House does not want to go there. And that's because they have let Putin deter the United States from behaving like a superpower. And that's deeply unfortunate. The North Korean development is the third development since late last spring to which the United States and NATO have not responded. Moscow is chipping away at NATO's deterrence, one by this large sabotage campaign across Europe, and perhaps heading to the United States if that Wall Street Journal report about the Russians placing explosives on DHL planes, which were heading to the United States and Canada. The U.S. and NATO have not responded to this. Now, over the past 6 or 8 weeks, we've seen regular Russian intrusions into NATO airspace with missiles and drones heading to Ukraine. NATO's not defending its own airspace against Russian provocations, again, chipping away at NATO's deterrence. And now North Koreans, and there's been no response. The White House response is, well, we're not going to put additional restrictions on use of American weapons as a result of this. That's ridiculous. The real response should have been, of course, now we're going to reconsider, and yes, not say a word, but let the Ukrainians use the longer range ATACMS against North Koreans heading to the front in Russia and against other strategic targets in Russia. This is a perfect case of us to begin to have a bolder policy, one that our interests demand.
And so is that the scenario that a personality like Donald Trump could actually have a benefit?
If he decides that Putin's trying to take him for a patsy, for a weak man, that's what we'll see.
I thought I'm conscious that whilst being the former ambassador of the United States to Ukraine, you also served as the US Consul General in Jerusalem. So I thought, if we may, we could just briefly touch on the situation in the Middle East. Benjamin Netanyahu has already described Donald Trump's election victory as history's greatest comeback. So what his view is not up for debate. But how do you see the US-Israeli relationship evolving over the next few months? And indeed, how do you think that will affect the Middle East conflict?
I suspect that Trump will be clearly better than Biden on what's happening in the Middle East for several reasons. First, before answering your question directly, the timidity we've seen from the Biden team in Eastern Europe has been evident in the Middle East. At this point in time, I don't know, is it over 400 or over 500 attacks by Iranian proxies on U.S. soldiers and U.S. ships in the Middle East with very limited American responses? We had well over 100 before 3 American soldiers were killed about a year ago. And the responses we made to the attacks before that were tiny. After that, we launched a decent response, but not strong enough given the fact that Americans died. Had we launched those stronger attacks before the Americans died, maybe they'd be alive. How many attacks have been launched at U.S. ships, protecting shipping in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea with limited U.S. response? Point of fact, the United States should be striking back at Iran. So the Iranians pay a price for their proxies. I think we'll see something like that from Trump. And of course, Biden's been trying to hamstring the Israelis as they went after Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. Now I understand why we'd want more nuance from Israel in the Gaza Strip, although we should have been clear from the beginning that civilian casualties in Gaza, the responsibility for them lie principally overwhelmingly with Hamas. But there's no reason for us to restrain the Israelis vis-a-vis Hezbollah or even vis-a-vis Iran. I suspect Trump understands what I've just said. Again, he's an intuitive politician, he's not from reading history books. But I think he understands that. And that's what I would expect. But it is true that Israel has always come to rely on unquestioning bipartisan support in the United States. And that's gone with the growth of woke politics in the Democratic Party. Not so in the Republican Party.
It's been fascinating to get your thoughts on all of these issues. I actually can't stand it when journalists do this to their interviewees, but I can't resist the temptation. So apologies in advance. But in one word, could you answer the following question? In your mind, is the world a safer place today than it was yesterday as a result of Donald Trump's victory?
I can't do a one-word answer. If the smart guys around Trump are in charge of foreign policy, absolutely, positively. I do believe that Trump, in terms of the American economy, getting rid of a lot of foolish woke policies that the Biden administration put in place, will be better for the United States domestically. And hopefully, it will lead the Democrats to reconsider. So in the future, their policies will be more moderate. That would be a great thing for this country. If the Joe Biden, who was a candidate, becomes a ruler of the guy who's most influential in the Democratic Party, as opposed to Joe Biden, who simply took the woke agenda, we'd all be better off.
That is your answer, and I cannot do anything about it. Thank you very much indeed. It's been fascinating to speak to you. We very much appreciate your time, and it would be wonderful at some point in the future to discuss these things with you again.
Happy to continue.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Herbst.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.